Thank you for inviting me to present to you about zombies. My name is Dr. Liz Chakar, and I truly enjoy talking about them because there's so much going wrong with them. And really, in the history of medicine, it's through looking at dysfunction that we finally understand, or have started to understand, the function of certain structures in the human body, and this is certainly true for the brain. So with that, let's watch a quick clip from one of my favorite movies.
That's pretty good.
Okay, right. Let's all try it together, shall we? 1, 2, 3.
All right, before we get into things, any of you guys recognize the film? Hopefully you guessed Shaun of the Dead. It's so good. If you haven't seen it, you got to see it. One of the best zombie movies out there. All right, so the zombies portrayed here are probably your most classic, typical sort of zombie, right? And probably things that you noticed is, there's something going wrong with their skin, although these are fairly new zombies, so you don't quite have the flaking, peeling kind of thing going on. Obviously, there's lots of jerky, kind of staggering types of movement and lots of moaning. So that's where I'm going to focus this talk. Focus on skin, muscle movement, and the central nervous system. So let's get a better understanding of these areas. Now, when we talk about skin, just in case you're not aware, the skin has two major layers. The first is the epidermis. You can see it right here, as well as the dermis below. And then underneath the actual skin is what's known as the hypodermis, or the subcutaneous layer, which is full of mostly fat and some blood vessels. A couple of other things to note: the epidermis, there are no blood vessels in that layer, it's just cells. We do have hair obviously penetrating through the epidermis, as well as some sweat pores. And then in the dermis, this is where we have our blood vessels, lots of different nerve endings, the base of our hair follicles, some oil glands or sweat glands, things like that. So there are 4 key things that are happening in the skin, right? Other stuff, but as far as zombies go, these are going to be the things that I think really help us understand what's going wrong with them. First of all, in healthy skin, we have regular cell division, right? I think we all understand that our skin sort of flakes off. Yeah, that's totally normal, and it's being replaced by new cells underneath. Keratin is found on the surface of our skin, our epidermis. Really important. I don't know how much you're aware of this, but there's lots of antimicrobial proteins that are being produced by the epidermis as well as the dermis. And then there are special structures that help keep the cells in the epidermis together, as well as keeping the epidermis attached to the dermis. Super important. We'll take a look at that as well. All right, let's start with cell division. When you cut yourself, right, and let's say you just have a little superficial cut, I think we all recognize that the skin has the ability to heal itself, right? So what's going on when we cut ourselves? So here's an image of something called epidermal wound healing. So this is a very superficial cut. This is just when your epidermis has been disrupted. So there's been a cut, the cells have been separated. This definition is sort of a cut. Now, let me just mention this again. The cells that are dividing are here in this basal layer. You see sort of cell division occurring right here. These will divide and push up to the superficial most layer, and then the cells will fall off. Now the cells here at the basal layer, you can see them in this image. It's saying that they are migrating across the wound. Now what's kind of really cool about those cells is that they exhibit something called contact inhibition, which means that when the cells are actually touching one another, they don't move, they stay put, and they just divide. However, when you have a disruption in that contact, again like in a cut, the cells will start moving toward one another until they touch, and then once they do, you can see that sort of in this image, they'll simply start dividing and filling in that space that's been disrupted by the cut. Now, I think we all recognize this too. If you have a particularly deep cut that goes into the dermis, there'll also be some bleeding. A scab may form. These cells will simply move underneath the scab until they touch and then start dividing, and then eventually the scab falls off. Sometimes if the cut, again, is particularly large, you may need to have some stitches to help pull the cells together. Because when there's too much of a gap, sometimes things like skin grafts are necessary because it's just too great a distance for these cells really to be expected to cover by themselves. Plus, you've got an open wound that can get infected. All right, so in zombies, probably what's going on is, I think by definition, we all recognize that zombies are dead. So that means there's no cell division going on. So when the zombie cuts itself or gets a gash or anything like that, it's not able to repair the skin. So when you see zombies with skin that's coming off, they've probably been damaged either by another zombie or just simply falling down. Again, they're not known for their coordinated movements, and the skin has not been able to heal itself. Now, what about keratin? So what is it? It is an amazing protein. Like sometimes the body is just mind-boggling, I guess. Keratin is found in things like our hair, our nails, but oh my goodness, like if you really pack keratin very tightly, you get things like horns, like in cows. You can have feathers are made of keratin, hooves, beaks, and birds. I mean, keratin is incredibly, incredibly strong material. And we have it again in our nails, in our hair, and also in the surface of our skin. So here is another image of the epidermis, and this is the dermis down here below. So all of this in this sort of dark purple to, I guess, lighter pink is the epidermis. So this would be the surface of your skin up here. This would be deep below. So this is where these cells are dividing, and they're pushing up, 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 up. As these cells are being pushed upward, they're producing keratin, and they're filling with keratin. So right about here, the cells are filled with so much of this really strong protein that they're actually dying off. Imagine like they've kind of cocooned themselves and are cut off from any nutrients and gases like oxygen that they may need to survive, so they simply die off, and again, your skin just flakes off. So keratin, again, is amazing. I mean, think about this. One of the reasons why, and you're hearing about this a lot right now, why you can wash your hands and stay safe from things like COVID is because microbes can't get across this keratin. It's just that tough. So as long as you don't have a break in the surface of your skin, when you wash your hands, you're disrupting the cell walls of these microbes, and you're literally just washing them away with water. So as you touch your food, you're not transmitting them to the non-keratinized epithelium that's inside your mouth and your digestive tract. To give you another idea of the strength of keratin, like if you touch like the outside of your cheek, I mean, it tends to be fairly soft, but you can scratch that fairly hard without worrying about damaging your face or cutting yourself. You wouldn't necessarily scratch the inside of your mouth with the same like vigor, I guess, because clearly the inside of your mouth is a lot softer. So that's what non-keratinized skin feels like. It's like the inside of your mouth. So again, super protective. So as far as zombies go, like sometimes we'll see zombies depicted with this sort of greenish tinge to them, right? And one of the things that keratin does is help protect you against things like funguses that can't quite take root. It's possible that in zombies, this keratin layer has been disrupted, and therefore it has a number of different fungal infections going on, giving it sort of that greenish, mossy kind of color tinge. Another thing that's helping you with keeping microbes at bay are antimicrobial proteins that are being produced by your epidermis and your dermis. So here's an image that's a little bit more complex. We won't get into the specific actual antimicrobial proteins, but hopefully what you can get out of this image is here on the surface of your epidermis, we have a combination of fungi, bacteria, viruses, and they live naturally on the surface of your skin. There's no getting away from that. And in general, they're not a problem as long as you can keep them at low enough levels. So your epidermis has immune cells called Langerhans cells that will produce antimicrobial peptides, keeping their numbers at bay. In the dermis, you'll have macrophages and other dendritic cells. These are immune cells that are helping to either gobble up, you can kind of see gobble up these microbes, or also produce antimicrobial defenses. And they'll usually help keep those microbes at bay from totally invading your hair follicles or even your sweat glands. So again, in zombies, it's highly likely that these cells are not functioning properly, so they are not creating these antimicrobial proteins. So there's lots of different infections that are occurring in zombie skins, kind of sometimes giving that pussy look even, because that is what pus is. It's dead white blood cells and microbes. So again, that kind of, again, that really greenish, infected sort of look. And the last thing with skin that I'd like to talk about are something called anchoring structures. Now, the other things with zombie skin you can kind of see on this particular zombie, especially around the mouth, is like the skin is sort of peeling away, and even around the neck area, it looks really wrinkled and kind of like it wants to fall off. Well, in your cells, the cells are being kept together in the epidermis by lots of different anchoring structures. And so what you're looking at here are two cells. So here's one cell here, here's another epidermal cell here, and then down here would be the dermis. And you see that they're being held together by sort of these, I don't know, almost like well, they kind of look like pipe cleaners, but they're these protein rods, right, attached to these other sort of more oval-shaped proteins that are holding the cells together. And not only that, they're holding the cells in the epidermis tightly secured to the dermis. So this means that when you bump your skin or you bump into something, your skin doesn't just fall off. Now, again, this gets a bit more complicated with the exact proteins. We won't go into that. Now, there is actually a condition, a real life condition, where sometimes these anchoring structures are either not produced properly or not produced at all. So there's something called epidermal lysis bullosa. The name is up here in the corner. So if you take a look, we have here an A, healthy skin, and then B, a patient with epidermal lysis bullosa. Now, I will say this is a very complex sort of skin disease, and it can run the gambit from minor sort of skin blistering to completely losing the skin both like inside your digestive tract as well as on your actual surface of your skin. So it can either be somewhat problematic to like life-threatening. Okay, so in healthy skin, again, here we have our epidermis and then the dermis. And then right here in the sort of the boundary between the two, we have these anchoring structures, and you can kind of, again, see those sort of oblong proteins. And then you'll see those nice protein strands kind of weaving in. It almost sort of reminds me of, in this image, of like shoelaces going through those little eyelets in your shoes, right? Kind of holding the two sides together, keeps it nice and strong. Okay, well, again, without worrying about the complex names for these proteins, if you take a look at someone who has epidermal lysis bullosa, you'll notice that the skin in the epidermis is flaking off because, again, some of these proteins are not being produced. So even within the epidermis, the cells are falling apart. And what you'll see here is that there's blistering between the epidermis and the dermis, meaning that the two layers are separating, because what you'll see here is that there's damaged or absent anchoring filaments. So those shoelaces are not there, right? So, and think about it, like if you didn't have shoelaces and just tried to put your shoe on, imagine how easily your foot comes out of your shoe. Same kind of thing. The epidermis can very easily separate from the dermis. So how does this relate back to zombies other than just the skin peeling away? Well, let me show you a picture of an individual who actually has this condition. It's a little bit hard to watch. So this is what that actually looks like, where the epidermis is separating from the dermis. And that's really due to very little contact or friction that's occurring. Again, it doesn't have that structural integrity to stay together. So I think you would agree with me that this is not unlike what we sort of see in some zombies, right? Is this kind of pattern of disruption to the skin. All right. Let's move from skin into a little bit of the movement of zombies. All right. Well, and we'll start with muscles and maybe some of the disruption that might be going on in muscles. Now, if you remember back, our protagonists were sort of trying to mimic that real lurchy kind of stiff movement that zombies were producing. Now, your muscle cells are like amazingly different cells than what you would normally think of as your classic cell. Okay. First of all, they're fairly large, right? So this is, I think this is pulled pork, although it could be pulled beef. I don't know. It's some sort of pulled barbecued meat that's been cooked for a long period of time. Now, if you look here, you can actually see these little individual strands that's a single muscle cell. So muscle cells are actually visible to the naked eye. You don't actually need a microscope in order to see a muscle cell. And maybe what you're noticing is these individual cells are kind of like clustered, sort of packaged together in these larger sort of units, and then those will be packaged together as well. So there's lots of connective tissue holding these muscle cells together. Now again, maybe in zombies that connective tissue is disrupted, so the muscle cells are falling apart. That will obviously affect some movement. But other things to remember about muscles: they work in these units. They have a really interesting intracellular structure, and we'll talk a bit about that. And they need lots of ATP to function. So let's talk about those motor units. So as I was mentioning, they're kind of clustered together. And when we have neurons from the brain through the spinal cord going to a specific muscle, so like in this diagram, here's a bicep muscle, and they've taken a cross section, and they're just showing you 3 different motor units. So this nerve is innervating part of the muscle, this nerve is innervating part of the muscle, and again, you can see kind of broken out in color. And it says here, muscle fibers of different motor units are intermingled, so that means they're spread, sort of diffuse evenly throughout the muscle. So the forces applied to the tendon remain roughly balanced regardless of which motor units are stimulated. So let's kind of take this apart. So what this means is that in your bicep muscle, it isn't just like on the left side or the right side, it's spread throughout. Because you can imagine if we just contracted all the motor units on the right side, it would be like a really weird kind of muscle spasmy kind of feel almost, right? That's not conducive to helping you lift up something, with your arms. The other key thing here is that these motor units are going to be really important in coordinated types of movement. So we may have some large motor units in some parts of the body, and then we may have some small motor units. So large motor units, I think you can imagine this, like the more muscle cells in a motor unit, the stronger the force of the contraction can be. The smaller the motor unit, obviously the less strong, or just fewer muscle cells there to contract. However, if we have many small motor units, that allows us to have very fine, precise movements versus some large motor units. Those will be more for like strength kinds of movements. And we usually find those in areas like the large muscles, like in our legs. The small motor units you'll usually find in areas like your hand, your eyes, things that need really that refined types of movements. Now, it may very well be that in zombies, these small motor units are not really functioning very well. Again, innervation is probably not that great, but zombies are not known for their dexterity. They're not particularly good at typing. For example, they're more likely to mash the keyboard. So probably what's happening is that just the large motor units have remained intact, which also means that their movements are going to be very jerky because they're no longer able to have these nice, fine, refined movements. It's just very big power movements all the time. And I think we all understand, even when you're walking, you're not always doing these big power movements, right? But if that's all you have, you probably have some kind of jerky movement. I'm combining structure and ATP together because I think it'll make the most sense. Now, I mentioned to you that the inside of skeletal muscle cells is really unique. And oh my gosh, so there are these protein strands called actin and myosin. And in this little diagram, or this movement diagram, you'll see that the myosin heads are sort of walking, if you will, along the actin filaments, and it's pulling the actin filaments closer together. Now imagine that like thousands of times in your muscle cells, all working together to coordinate a muscle contraction. Okay, that's what a muscle contraction is. It's just all of these little myosin heads moving together, pulling those actin filaments closer to one another. Okay, now in order for it to do this, it needs lots of ATP. You need one ATP to get the head to attach and move, and then you need a second ATP for it to detach. Now, you may have heard of something called rigor mortis, right? It's when the body sort of stiffens up into a position after death. What happens there is that the body at death releases a lot of ATP. Those myosin heads attach to the actin, they contract, but there's not enough ATP around to allow them to detach. So they stay attached. So it basically causes like this tetanus, this muscle tension for a few hours after death. Now, what happens to relax the body is that, again, the cells are decaying, so they're releasing digestive enzymes some hours after death, and those digestive enzymes will actually dissolve some of the myosin heads. Now, it may very well be that in zombies, some of those myosin heads are still attached, like they didn't fully digest. So their muscle movements are very jerky because their muscles are always sort of in a contracted state. I mean, you can imagine that if you're constantly clenching your muscles and you're trying to move, like your movements are going to be a bit jerky. They're not nice, smooth movements. So that may very well be what's happening with zombies. They're just in a rigor mortis state as they're trying to move. Now, I will say this. They are dead, and again, we said that there's no cell metabolism occurring after death, no growth. So the fact that there's any ATP allowing for movement is really not possible, but we just need to suspend disbelief for that little bit. All right. Let's talk a little bit about the nervous system. That is the other part of what will help with muscle movement, right, is the innervation going from the brain down to the muscle. But it has a few more things to do with zombies. So things we're going to talk about. Neurons are very highly specialized cells, and that'll be important in like why we may have some dysfunction. Specific brain regions control muscle movement. This will be important. Clear and coherent speech is a function of a number of brain regions. Again, zombies are not known for their eloquent speeches. And I think we recognize this, but your brain is responsible for your sense of self, your own identity as human and alive. This will be important. All right. So in this image, what you're looking at here, this is from the central nervous system, from the brain. Here we have some neurons, so those are the nerve cells. But what you'll see is an entourage of other cells helping to support them. I mean, neurons are amazing. I mean, think about this. This is a cell that can conduct an electrical signal, right? It goes from the brain down to your muscles, telling you to move, telling you to, how to type words, how to think thoughts. It's amazing that actually happens. And think about how fast that has to happen, right? I mean, you see something, you have to be able to react to it right away, or you see something and it inspires you, right? But that's very quick processing. So in order to be quick, you have to have the right conditions to function with that kind of speed, right? So neurons are really highly specialized cells that need very specific ion balance in their surrounding area in order for them to function properly. They also need lots of protection and other cells to kind of clear the area around them. So what you see here, again, is an entourage of cells, that's what I'm calling an entourage of cells, that are helping to care for the neurons, making sure that they are well protected and they have all the right conditions in order to function properly. Now, in zombies, what's likely happening is that these cells have either died off or their functions with one another has been somehow disrupted. Now, when that happens, neurons cannot fire properly. So they can't send that signal down to muscles. They can't send that signal to the other brain region that says, oh, flower, pretty, I like, right? Zombies don't have that kind of complex thought. So again, probably what's going on is that there's been some damage to the central nervous system, to this complex interplay between cells, and that real requirement for neurons to have a proper ion balance in order to function. Because let's remember, let me back up a second. In order to have that ion balance, you need to have a good circulation, so you can have a good transfer of ions to and from the bloodstream. And I mean, zombies are not known for their amazing circulation and good blood pressure, right? So there's probably not that turnover. So again, neurons are being affected in their ability to fire. So again, leading to, cognitive deficits, let's say, as well as, again, jerky muscle movements. Ah, what is this thing? Kill it with fire. Your brain has an area called the primary motor cortex. See a slide of it in a second. This is what this primary motor cortex thinks you look like. So there's a lot of your primary motor cortex that's devoted to your hands, and then to your face and mouth and vocalization. So here's the brain. You'll see there's a plane cut through this sort of pinkish area that's called the precentral gyrus. And this is a frontal section of the primary motor cortex on the right side of the cerebral hemisphere. And what you see here is on the side, so somewhere right about here-ish, there's a very large portion of the brain that is dedicated to vocalization, so to speech, and basically the movement of your mouth and tongue and your pharynx and your vocal cords and things like that. I mean, think about it. Speech is really complex, right? I mean, it's hard enough to talk sometimes. But just even think about it, like compared to like a dog or a cat, like dogs don't really have much volume control, for example, and they're barking. So even just that, even just volume control and the amount of information we can convey in our speech just by changing how loud we are, right, is really important. So anyway, a large portion of the brain on that lateral side is going to be dedicated to vocalization, to the actual production of speech. And then the other part of your brain, kind of going more toward the central top portion, a large chunk is dedicated to your hand. Now again, if we think back to talking about those little motor units, remember the hand had a lot of them because we have lots of very fine movements that we do with our hands. I mean, think about like the art that's produced, like the paintings, the drawings. I mean, it's fine面 control. Less so area is necessary for things like your elbow, your wrist, your shoulder, even like your legs. Those are larger motor units. They don't quite require as much processing. Right. So anyway, so this is the brain region that is going to send information down to those body parts, down to like your little, your thumb, your index finger, little ring finger, telling you to move and move in a specific way. Now, again, it's very likely that in zombies, I think one of the things we recognize, a lot of times their brains are not quite intact. It's very likely that this primary motor cortex has been damaged, so their movements are not quite as coordinated, including vocalization, and we'll just kind of put a pin in that. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. Again, talking about movement, it's not just the primary motor cortex. So you can see here the motor area in the cerebral cortex up here. There's this region of the brain called the thalamus, but then also the cerebellum, and then you'll see down here sensory signals from sensory neurons in muscles, joints, as well as eyes. We'll get into some of this other things. But anyway, so what happens is when you decide that you want to, let's say, walk forward, right? Your primary motor cortex and there's other fine motor areas in the cerebral cortex will send signals down to those muscles, to your legs, saying, okay, walk forward. But then you also get input from the actual muscles, from the joints in your legs, as well as your eyes, basically going, okay, the intent was to walk forward in a straight line. What am I actually doing? And let me send quick corrective measures to make sure that I actually am walking in a nice, smooth, straight line. Now, that's going to be really the job of the cerebellum, is to compare your intent with what you're actually doing. Like, are you doing that thing? Yes, no, well, let's make sure we send the right signal to correct that so you're actually walking in a straight line. I'll give you a great example. When people drink too much, and you know how like drunks will kind of have that staggering, kind of sloppy movement, right? Again, not very refined, almost zombie-like sometimes. What's happening is that the cerebellum is being affected by the alcohol. Remember what we said, nerves have to have a very specific ionic balance. Alcohol can disrupt how they fire, right? It's normally not present in the ions that allow your brain to function properly. So when the nerve firing in the cerebellum is disrupted, it can't do its job saying, hey, I know you meant to walk in a straight line, but you're kind of swerving to the left, and the officer is not going to believe you that you're not drunk, right? Same thing with speech, right? Not only are some of the motor cortex areas affected, but again, the cerebellum is being affected. So the processing that you're getting from like, oh, I meant to say this, but I'm hearing myself say that, you're not getting that. So again, your speech tends to be a little bit more sloppy and slurred. So this very well is likely damaged in zombies as well. So the cerebellum, as zombies are kind of lurching, kind of in their staggery kind of movement, it's not able to send those really important signals saying, hey, those are not smooth movements. I know what you mean to do is this. However, you're either totally overreaching whatever, smashing into something, or you're kind of staggering off to one direction or another. I kind of think that's cool. Now, we saw that the primary motor cortex had on the lateral side had a large area, somewhere right about in here, that was dedicated to moving things like your mouth, your tongue, your pharynx to allow you to vocalize. There's also another important brain region right in front of that primary motor cortex called Broca's speech area that is really important in speech production. So people who have had either damage to their Broca's area due to, a trauma or a stroke or something like that, will often have, depending on how bad that damage is, obviously. But if they had, let's say, like a total loss of Broca's area, they would have a really hard time producing speech. This speech production area definitely ties into the primary motor cortex area. And so their speech will come out really slurred or very moany-like, or sometimes they'll even take very large breaks in between words because it's very difficult for them to actually produce the word. Wernicke's area is also important in speech comprehension, and there's a primary auditory cortex, that's the hearing part. Again, some of your speech is going to be what you hear and making corrections to how you're speaking. So if there's damage to like this side part of the brain, really that would make sense as to why all they can produce is sort of like a guttural moan that you hear, because all of their ability to process language, all of their ability to make any kind of corrections to what they're actually trying to say has been taken away from them. So all they can produce is that little moaning, kind of monotonous sort of sound. All right. Your brain also is really important in giving you your sense of self. Now, there's something called Cotard delusion. You'll see here in this image. It's also called the walking corpse syndrome, although that's not the medical term, obviously. It's basically a mental illness where the patients believe that they are dead or don't exist. And that it's kind of wild. Or sometimes they'll even think that they don't have organs in their bodies, so they feel that they're hollow, even though they're clearly not. They clearly have all their digestive organs, they have a heart. However, they don't feel that they do. And if they're hollow inside, they must be dead, right? So a lot of times they'll either think that they're zombies, or sometimes it'll manifest that they think that they're vampires, because if they're already dead but walking around, the other walking dead is a vampire, right? So sometimes they think that they're actually vampires. Usually this is due to damage when they've looked at people who've had this using either PET scans or MRIs. There's either damage to the frontal lobes, that's by your forehead, or the parietal cortex. So it's sort of like the middle top part of your brain, sort of around where the motor cortex area was. But there are other brain regions between the frontal lobe and the parietal cortex that are responsible for your conscious awareness and your ability to create a sense of self, that I am me and I am alive. So again, in zombies, these brain regions have probably been disrupted, so they are dead, right? But even in real life, there is something, if you disrupt those brain regions, you actually do think that you are dead. There is some treatment that they try to do with medications. A lot of times people will respond to that. But clearly there's, it's a fairly complex, although rare condition that occurs. All right. Well, I could talk about zombies for an entire semester, and we could get into so much more detail, but this is all the time that we have. So hopefully by looking at the skin, muscle movements, and a little bit of the central nervous system, you've gotten a little bit of a better idea of some of the science behind zombies. Thank you again for inviting me to present to you about them. I hope you enjoyed the talk.